Yo guys, Jin here, and today I'll be going over a Blizzard build. There'll be two variations, an Uber and a non-Uber. They can both clear tier 90 pits and above. Not sure how high above, as I've not really tested that in that way, but it's pretty solid and pretty fun to play, at least for me. So if you like this kind of video detailing the builds, please leave a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell as it helps out a lot. So let's get into this build. Remember, everything will be in the description below, and that will have both the Uber and non-Uber variations. So starting with the skill tree, we're going to take 2 into Firebolt. We're going to take 2 into Frozen Orb, and go for Greater Frozen Orb. Then in our defensive skills, we're going to take 1 into Flame Shield, 3 into Teleport, and go for Shimmering Teleport. We're going to go for 1 in Elemental Attunement, 3 into Glass Cannon, 1 into Ice Armor, and go for Shimmering Ice Armor. And then we'll go for 5 into Frost Nova, and go for the Mystical Frost Nova. Down in the Conjuration skills, we're going to take 3 into Conjuration Mastery, then we're going to go for 1 in Align the Elements, 3 in Mana Shield, and 3 in Protection. Coming down to our Mastery skills, we're going to take 1 into Blizzard, and we're going to go for Mage's Blizzard. Then we'll also take 1 into Inner Flames, and 3 into Devouring Blaze. Then in our ultimate skills, we take 3 into Permafrost, Hoarfrost, Frigid Breeze, and Icy Touch. We're also going to take 1 into Unstable Currents and go for the Prime Unstable Currents. And lastly, in our key passives, we're going to be taking the Shatter key passive. If you do happen to have a Harlequin Crest, you would take the point out of Flame Shield and put that into Teleport. Next up we have the Paragon Board. So we have an 8 glyph board here, and we're going to start at the beginning. Obviously, we're going to put in the Tactician glyph, so we'll deal 10% increased damage for 4 seconds after casting a defensive skill, and that will be increased by 4 seconds for each defensive skill not on our action bar. So since we have all of them on our action bar, that doesn't actually get a huge bonus. For our second board, we're going for Enchantment Master. And we're going to put in the Elementalist glyph here, so dealing fire, cold or lightning damage to an enemy increases all damage we deal to them by 5% for 10 seconds, stacking once per element. For our third board, we're going for the Icefall board here, and we're going to put in the Winter glyph. So whenever we chill or freeze an enemy, we deal 4% increased cold damage for 10 seconds, and that will stack up to 18%. And we're going to make sure we get the legendary node, of course. So our frost skills deal 15% increased damage to vulnerable, double that if they are frozen. For our fourth board, we're going to get the Frigid Fate board, making sure we also take the legendary node. So you deal bonus damage to vulnerable enemies equal to 10% of the amount of our bonus damage with cold, up to a maximum of 30%. We're going to put in the Stalagmite glyph here for the Ice Spike damage, and our Ice Spikes gain 20% increased critical strike chance. Bear in mind that my Stalagmite glyph here is only level 15, as I will have to level that up to 21 later. For our fifth board, we're going to be taking the Burning Instinct board, and we're going to put in the Destruction glyph here for the critical strike damage. And critical strikes increase all damage the enemy takes from us by 2% for 10 seconds, up to 12%. Next we go up to our sixth board, that's going to be the Ceaseless Conduit board. And we're going to put in the Exploit glyph for the vulnerable damage, and dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases our damage by 1% for 6 seconds, up to 10%. For our seventh board, we're going to go for the Searing Heat board, and put in the Control glyph. That's going to give us damage to CC'd enemies, and we deal 10% increased damage to slowed or chilled, 20% increase to stunned or frozen. And for our 8th board, the final board, we're going for the Static Surge board. Our glyph will be the Flame Feeder glyph for the damage to burning enemies, and also we deal 10% increased direct damage to burning enemies. So it rounds out the Paragon board, pretty straightforward. Again, all of this will be in the description below if I went too fast for you. Make sure you check that out. And that will also have the Uber and non-Uber versions of the build. Next up, we have the enchantments. So for our first enchantment, we're going to go with Frozen Orb. So whenever we cast a non-basic skill, we have a 30% chance to launch a Frozen Orb at a nearby enemy. And the modifier is Frozen Orb's Explosion, has a 40% chance to make all enemies hit vulnerable for 3 seconds. And frozen enemies are also always made vulnerable. So this is a huge source of vulnerable for us and why we are using it. For our second enchantment, we're using Firebolt. So direct damage from skills applies up to an additional 23% burning damage over 8 seconds. We're using that so we can apply our Flame Feeder glyph damage, and for the Devouring Blaze bonus. Next up we have the gear. So just a reminder for this build, I'm going to be showcasing the final version of the build, but in the build planner in the description below, there'll be the alternative versions without any Ubers required, or with just one of the Ubers and the flicker step. So keep that in mind, and there'll also be a raiment version in there as well. All of these variations are capable of clearing at least tier 90 in the pit, so keep that in mind. So now I'll go over the gear, and on the left I'll list the affixes and tempering you would want to get for the items, and I'll let you know what we want to be masterworking. So for the helm, we're going to be using a Harlequin crest, and we're going to try and masterwork the cooldown reduction on this. If you don't have a Harlequin crest, you could use a Godslayer crown, also going to masterwork the cooldown reduction, or you would want a helm with mana per second, intelligence, and cooldown reduction. You would temper that with max life and lucky hit percent chance to slow, and you would also try and masterwork cooldown reduction. As for the aspect, you would want to be using the aspect of Everliving, and that's going to allow you to take 10 to 25% less damage from CC'd or vulnerable enemies. Next up we have the Chestpiece. We're just using a normal Chestpiece here. We're going to be using something with intelligence, mana per second, and armor. As for the tempering, we're going with total armor, and we're also going to be going for lucky hit percent chance to freeze. As for the aspect, we're going to be using the aspect of Concussive Strike, so damaging an enemy has up to a 20% chance to daze them for 2 seconds, and also we'll deal 5 to 20% increased damage to dazed enemies. For the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the mana per second, or secondary, the intelligence. Next up we have the gloves. We're going to be using some normal gloves with crit chance, crit damage, and attack speed. We're going to try and temper that with ice spike damage and lucky hit percent chance to stun. We're going to be trying to masterwork the ice spike damage here, but you can't really go wrong with either of the masterworkings besides the lucky hit percent chance to stun. As for the aspect, we're going with Conceited, so we'll deal 10 to 25% increased damage whilst having a barrier active. Next up we have the pants. We're going for Tybalt's Will here, and we want to try and masterwork the damage reduction from close enemies. Pretty straightforward here. We're definitely using this for the unique aspect, the 10 to 20% increased damage while unstoppable and for 5 seconds after, and when we become unstoppable we gain 50 of our primary resource. So if you don't have access to Tybalt's Will, you would just use pants with intelligence, max life, and resist all. And you would want to temper that with Frost Nova cooldown reduction and Frost Nova size. As for the masterworking, you would want to try and masterwork the intelligence. For the aspect, you would want to use the Snowguards aspect, so while within your own blizzard and for 3 seconds after leaving it, you take 15 to 30% less damage. Or the aspect of the Unwavering, so taking direct damage has a 2 to 7% chance to reset the cooldown of one of your defensive skills. For the boots, we're going to be using the Flicker Step boots for the unique aspect. Each enemy we evade through reduces our active ultimate cooldown by 4 seconds in my case, up to 10 seconds per evade. So if you're using this properly, you can basically keep your unstable currents up pretty much indefinitely. So we're going to try and masterwork the damage reduction from close enemies here. And if you don't have access to Flicker Step, you would want to use boots with intelligence, mana per second, and move speed. And you would want to temper that with teleport cooldown reduction and lucky hit percent chance to immobilize. As for the masterworking, you would want to masterwork the intelligence or mana per second. And for the aspect, you would want to use the aspect of Bounding Conduit. So teleport's cooldown is reduced by 1 to 2.5 seconds, and after teleporting, crackling energy hits 2 additional enemies for 5 seconds, which isn't really that important, but the teleport cooldown reduction allows you to keep more barriers active, which is really handy for this build. Next up we have the main hand. We're going to be using a 1 tier, and we want to get intelligence, vulnerable damage, and crit damage on this. As for the tempering, we're going to get the lucky hit percent chance for poison damage, and also the ice spike damage. As for the masterworking, we're going to want to try and masterwork the ice spike damage. Although I don't think you can really go too wrong here with whatever gets upgraded, besides the lucky hit percent chance to poison, as we're only using that for the Talrash's ring. For the aspect, we're going to be using the aspect of control, so we deal 20 to 35% more damage to immobilize, stunned, or frozen enemies. Next up, we have the offhand. We're going to be looking for something with intelligence, crit chance, and cooldown reduction. We're going to temper that with ice spike damage and blizzard size. And we're going to try and masterwork the critical strike chance or cooldown reduction. As for the aspect, we're going to be using the Storm Swell aspect, so we deal 15 to 30% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while we have a barrier. Next up, we have the Amulet. We are going to be looking for something with crit chance, Hoarfrost, and cooldown reduction. Attack speed would be a 4th option. We're going to temper that with Unstable Currents cooldown reduction and ice spike damage. As for the masterworking, we would want to try and masterwork the ranks into Hoarfrost. As you can see here, the stats that I have on mine aren't really optimal. As for the aspect, we want to be going for the Glacial aspect. This is where the damage comes from the ice spikes. So when we cast Blizzard, it will periodically spawn the exploding ice spikes that deal damage, and they will deal 23% multiplicative increased damage to frozen enemies. So that's really important, you need the Glacial aspect for this build. Next up we have the rings. We're going to be using Talrash's Iridescent Loop. That's going to be giving us the awesome unique aspect, so for each type of elemental damage we deal, gain 10 to 15% increased damage for 4 seconds, up to 60%. So we get all 4 bonuses with this build, so that is 40 to 60% increased multiplicative damage. And we want to try and masterwork the non-physical damage or the cooldown reduction here. For our second ring, we're using another uber unique, the Ring of Starless Skies. That's going to give us some crit strike chance, crit strike damage, and core damage, and some lucky hit chance. We want to try and masterwork the critical strike chance here. And we also get the awesome unique aspect. Spending our primary resource reduces the cost of our skills and increases our damage by 10% for 3 seconds. And that will stack up to 50% and keep refreshing as we keep spending primary resource. If you don't have access to these rings, then the alternatives would be the Blue Rose. That's going to give you crit strike damage, ice spike damage, lucky hit chance, and mana cost reduction, of which you would try and masterwork the mana cost reduction. Also, damaging an enemy has up to a 30% chance to form an exploding ice spike, triple that chance if the enemy is frozen, and that will occur on lucky hit. So really handy ring if you don't have a Ring of Starless Skies. If you don't have access to either of these 3 rings, you would just use a ring with crit chance, attack speed, and resource reduction. And you would use that for both rings. And you would temper those with ice spike damage, and ranks it to Frigid Breeze or resource cost reduction. As for the aspects, you would want to use Prodigies, so using a cooldown restores 10 to 25 mana, or you would use Umbral, so restore 1 to 6 of your primary resource when you crowd control an enemy. That pretty much wraps it up for the gear. For the gems, we're using the skulls in the jewellery, rubies in the armour, and in the weapons you want to be using the sapphires, which obviously I once again forgot to do. So that pretty much wraps up the build. Thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed this video or learned something, or you made it this far, please leave a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. It helps me out a lot, and it's really appreciated, helps the channel grow. So thanks a lot for watching. I'll leave you with some blizzarding, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye!